Well, let's continue our discussion right now with our panel. With us here in Washington is Omar Samad. He is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Joining me as well is PJ Crowley. He was the former Assistant Secretary of State and author of Red Line, American Foreign Policy in a Time of Fractured Politics and Failing States. Also on set with us, Shuja Nawaz is a distinguished fellow with the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to all of you. Ambassador, let me start with you. A ninth round of peace talks, and as we just heard from our reporter, the U.S. Special Representative says he's hopeful. Former Afghan President Hamid Karzai says this presents the best prospect for peace in the country. What is your feeling?
I think it's correct. I think that Ambassador Khalilzad is on his way to Doha. He has new marching orders per se because he had an important meeting with officials and the president last week. It seems that the Americans, from what I'm hearing, are more concerned about the outcome, the results, and making sure that the Taliban do not end up with a more powerful hand in this whole deal, that there are some criteria that have to be met, that there are some results in terms of their assurances and guarantees given in the fight against terrorism later on, and also their participation in an intra-Afghan process, and also the whole issue of how to come and bring about a ceasefire at some point. So I think Khalilzad has already accomplished some tasks, but now he has added tasks, and he wants to solidify these. It's going to be interesting to see how the Taliban first react to this, whether they're going to play along or not, how Kabul is going to react, because Kabul also will be part of some kind of a deal separate from the Taliban deal when that happens, and how the region as well is going to look at this, because their role, whether we like it or not, in the Afghan case is also important.
Very quick question to you before I move on, Ambassador, and that is, you say certain criteria would have to be met by the Taliban. Who makes sure that the Taliban meets those criteria?
So on one hand, obviously, it's their own pledge and their own way of giving guarantees. Now, there has to be an enforcement mechanism attached to the deal. And that enforcement mechanism has to be very clear, and it has to be backed by the international community at some level, somehow. Whether the UN is going to be involved, whether other great powers are going to be involved, who is going to play a certain role. But one of the things that I think Ambassador Khalilzad has been working on is at some point to create a counterterrorism task force. And this task force is supposed to be a multinational task force, which means that if the Taliban agree and the terms are agreed upon, then there will be a collection of different countries who will continue to play a role in Afghanistan, making sure that the bad guys, the international terrorist organizations, do not find a hub again in the country.
PJ Crowley, there is something that the Taliban and President Trump agree with. They both want American troops out. This is what President Trump had to say. Let's watch this.
It's a war that has been going on for almost 19 years now, and frankly, it's ridiculous. But with that being said, it's a dangerous place, and we have to always keep an eye on it. We are bringing some of our troops back, but we have to have a presence. Right now, what we're doing is we're negotiating with the government, and we're negotiating with the Taliban, and we'll see what happens from it.
The question is, PJ Crowley, is the president says that it's a dangerous place and we have to keep an eye on it. If American troops pull out, who's going to keep an eye on it?
Well, I think the key word there is war. I mean, the United States has been directly involved for 18 years. The Afghan civil war has gone on for much longer than that. You know, the challenge here is whether the key parties recognize that they can no longer achieve their objectives through military force alone. That's crucial. So if we can move from a civil war to a negotiated settlement, that's advantageous. Obviously, as you just talked about, there are lots of questions surrounding this, and obviously the Islamic State has added a new serious dimension to this. Even if you get the Taliban to agree to various criteria, including their renouncing violence, renouncing al-Qaeda, respecting the Afghan constitution, and being willing to be a peaceful participant in a political process, Whether the Islamic State cooperates with that is a question. Whether Pakistan cooperates with that is a question. Afghanistan, you've got Russia has the ability to complicate issues. So does Iran. But I think that first and foremost, getting to this negotiation has been very important. It's something the Obama administration tried to do for 8 years for a variety of reasons. That negotiation never launched. We have it. I think it's very valuable, but obviously what happens on the ground going forward is going to be very critical. But I would say that if we are able to gain a ceasefire, it doesn't necessarily mean that the United States' role in Afghanistan or NATO's role in Afghanistan will necessarily end. A future Afghan government will require considerable international support going forward. I think the United States and others are willing to continue to help. The nature of that help will be something that has to be determined in the future.
Shuja, I'm going to pose the question that PJ just asked, and that is the role of Pakistan. And will Pakistan cooperate with this? Pakistan certainly has a huge stake in these peace talks and what happens there. What will Pakistan be seeking?
It's not just Pakistan alone. I think it's the whole region, and that's the part that I'm still looking for in terms of policy from the United States. What is its regional approach? What is its vision for involving other countries in the region? And Iran has not been mentioned, although one hears whispers every now and then that some back channel has been opened up with Iran. I think back to 1986 and the Soviet Politburo meeting when Gorbachev wanted them to decide on what to do about exiting from Afghanistan. He started off by saying, we've been fighting for 6 years. At this rate, we'll continue fighting for 20 years. That reminds me of what President Trump said. We've been fighting for so long. And then Gorbachev said, we have to go to Pakistan. We have to go to the region. And that was the approach that worked for them. And I think that's the approach that can work for the US. I am sorry that I don't hear too much about the regional approach or what can be done, because it's not solely an internal Afghan problem. The region can play a positive role or it can play a negative role. And we need to bring the region together on it. Now, what does Pakistan want? It doesn't want a Taliban government in Kabul, because that would be disastrous for Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban are already using Afghanistan territory to launch attacks. The group from Sawat, which was ousted by the Pakistan military, has found refuge in Nuristan and Kunar. That is where the Islamic State is also now gathered. And look at the mathematics of it all. You talked about the assistance, and I agree entirely. The US has to commit, and so does the coalition. 40-plus countries have to commit to giving economic support to Afghanistan, without which they can't even maintain their army of close to 300,000.
Right.
And we're talking about 10,000 Taliban in the whole country, armed militants. All these numbers are obviously hard to verify, but they will need support in clearing Kunar, in clearing Nuristan, in clearing the area where the Islamic State is got a foothold.
Right. Shuja, you mentioned Iran. What role do you see Iran playing in this?
Iran has an economic role. It also has a political role. It also has a role in the ethnic rivalries inside Afghanistan. If you know that the target of even the recent attack were the Hazara. So that's a Shia-Sunni thing. And the Islamic State is a very rabidly right-wing Sunni group, militant group. And that kind of sectarian warfare is something that doesn't suit Iran, and it doesn't suit Afghanistan, and it doesn't suit the region.
Yeah. Ambassador Shuja talked about a regional approach to a lasting peace in Afghanistan. In fact, President Ashraf Ghani, he did make a speech in which he addressed this particular issue. That speech was made during the festival of Eid. This is part of what he had to say. Let's watch this.
Our future cannot be decided outside, whether in the capital cities of our friends, nemesis, or our neighbors. The future of Afghanistan can be decided in Afghanistan.
So the first part of my question is President Ghani supportive of these talks taking place in Doha?
I'm not quite sure. Yes, on the surface he is, because everybody has to support peace. Who is going to come out and say, I'm for war?
Yeah.
Even though some people probably do for other reasons. But he is very supportive, very much supportive of the elections, that he sees that he can, through these elections, regain power, regain some legitimacy, and then he feels that he can enter into talks with Taliban, which is something that other Afghan political leaders, I think, are apprehensive of. You know, we don't know exactly who he's referring to when he says that he's not going to let outsiders. Is he referring to Washington? Is he referring to other countries? But also, remember, he's in campaign mode, so he has to speak this language at this point. But let me also say that Afghanistan's deep-rooted issues are not really due and caused by civil war, because look, we talked about ISIL, we're talking about Al-Qaeda, we're talking about all these non-state actors who are non-Afghan mostly, who are in Afghanistan or in the region between Afghanistan, Pakistan, even in the northern parts of Afghanistan. So the Afghan problem is first and foremost a fight against terrorism, and there are different parts to that. Yes, there are issues, lingering issues from the 80s and 90s that Afghans have to resolve. 95% of that has been resolved.
You don't think ethnicity has some role in this?
No, not at all. I think that 90% of Afghanistan's issues from the 80s and 90s that were caused by the Soviet invasion have been resolved. It's only the Taliban who are left out of the Afghan political equation.
Right.
And so the whole purpose should be on how do you reintegrate the Taliban, those Afghan Taliban who are for a peaceful resolution, laying down their arms, agreeing to working together with other Afghans, and trying to rebuild the country, and for them and their families to return and come back to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So that is the crux of the issue: how to bring the last, basically, diaspora group of Afghans who have been fighting back into the mold and the fold of the Afghanistan that has been created since 2001.
When President Ghani talks about the future of Afghanistan being decided in Afghanistan, what does that mean?
Well, I think it's rhetoric mostly. Yes, part of the, he's talking about elections. I think that he's referring to elections. As I said, that is the only avenue that the president sees as being his best chances of hanging on to power. And anything else will probably be a distraction to his political goals.
Right.
So he has to speak that way. But I think that everybody realizes the Afghanistan issue is partly an Afghan problem, and partly, obviously, it has to do with so many competing agendas and rivalries in the region and beyond the region. And so some of it we alluded to, the role that Iran. Then obviously, when you bring up Iran, you have to bring up the Saudis. When you bring up Pakistan, you have to bring up India. If you bring up the Chinese and the Russians. So it is a very complex situation, and we need to find the right balance. Internally, we have to find the right balance to find a political settlement, and as well as with the different rivalries that exist outside of Afghanistan.
Right. PJ Crowley, of course, the United States envoy is a seasoned diplomat. That's Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad. What is his best hope from these talks?
I think his best hope is to gain an understanding between the United States and the Taliban first, as a stepping stone to what is ultimately critical, which is a direct conversation between the Taliban and the Afghan government. That's vital. And then from there, you can begin to grow a broader conversation. I disagree that there's been no emphasis on regional approach. For at least 10 years, the United States has been hugely focused on a regional approach, to Afghanistan. And obviously another complication is the renewed struggle between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. One has to recognize that whether it's India looking at Afghanistan or Pakistan looking at Afghanistan, they calculate their respective approaches to Afghanistan with respect to where they believe they are in terms of their own regional rivalry. So I think that if the United States and the Taliban can reach an understanding, that's good, but that has to be a stepping stone to something larger. If not, then it would be an area of great concern.
Shuja, the United States, of course, has accused Pakistan of harboring terrorists. President Trump has also suspended aid to Pakistan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was recently here in the United States. They held talks. Do they have to resolve those issues first before they can make some progress on Pakistan's role in getting peace in Afghanistan?
No, I think the U.S. needs to craft a Pakistan policy separately, and that has been missing for quite some time. Even in the Obama years, it was the reverse order. It was Afghanistan that was wagging the dog. And so AFPAC was the wrong way of defining this problem. If the U.S. has a relationship with Pakistan, and PJ, I mean, Pakistan is not the region. The region includes Iran.
I sat in Islamabad with the Secretary of State and the Pakistan Foreign Minister talking about a new relationship between the United States and Pakistan. The United States contributed very significant dollars to Pakistan in terms of civilian aid to try to help Pakistan transform its relationship between the government and its own people. We have had a Pakistan strategy, going back to Richard Holbrooke and the beginning of the Obama administration. What we never got was a commitment from Pakistan that it would cease, its tacit support for the Taliban, in Afghanistan. Yeah. So I assure you, we have spent a great deal of time talking to Pakistan, whether it was during the Bush administration, during the Obama administration, during the Trump administration, and what we really need is Pakistan's decision regarding what kind of a relationship it's going to have with Afghanistan and what kind of relationship it's going to allow India to have with Afghanistan. If we can settle that, lots of things become possible.
Yes, but the reality is, and you know that as well as I do, the aid that was given to Pakistan, the $7.5 billion under the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, much of it has still been not dispersed. It is still undispersed, and much of it has been reprogrammed. But that's a separate issue. My main question is, when you talk of the region, Pakistan is not the only country that is in the region. Iran plays a critical role, and we need to have a much more explicit involvement of the Iranians, as we did after 9/11.
That's absolutely true, and I think that's one of the complications here. Russia at times has been helpful. Yep. Russia over the past few years has been supporting the Taliban because it complicates matters for the United States. Under the Obama administration, there was some hope that there could be a constructive conversation, with Iran. With the Trump administration withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, now that becomes highly problematic. No, I completely agree with you that ultimately solving this, it is a multidimensional challenge, and right now at least two of those pieces or three of those pieces, even given some, I'm sure, some tensions that now exist within the Modi government over what's happening in Kashmir, there's the potential for a broader constructive conversation is much more difficult today than it was 3 or 4 years ago.
And it is also in Pakistan's own interest to resolve this because of the problem in the border region.
Right. I want to bring the ambassador in. What are your thoughts on this, the regional approach, and the fact that there are so many interests that have to be satisfied?
Right, as we discussed. So as I said earlier, I used the word balance, the balancing act at the regional level. It is a function of finding the right consensus amongst all the players. Now, Pakistan has a role to play. Yes, we all know that Pakistan has not always been helpful, and it actually unfortunately played a spoiler's role and has used the Taliban for its own purposes. We all hope that now they have realized that we have reached a point where we can have a win-win situation. But it does not mean that it needs to be a zero-sum game. It does not mean that one side has to win everything or lose everything. And so this is what I think Ambassador Khalilzad's mission is to find that consensus within Afghanistan between all the competing Afghan groups and political players, as well as outside of Afghanistan. And I think that he has been moving along on this trajectory. It's a question of putting the pieces together and making sure that they're all tied to each other, because it's a puzzle with different dimensions. And so it's not an easy case, but I think he's moving. It's a question of how much time does he have. So time becomes a very important factor in all of this. And also whether all the players are going to agree to basically the rule of the game and agreeing on what the end state should look like.
Right. PJ, do you think the United States would agree to be the policeman of any kind of agreement, to say that we are here to ensure that it will be carried out, that all sides will abide by the terms of any deal?
I think eventually you're going to have to internationalize, this challenge. I think we all agree that there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism. What that is, who's involved, what are the carrots, what are the sticks. That's going to be highly complicated. So I think that the short answer is probably not as the enforcer.
Yeah.
But what the Obama administration was trying to do, and I'm sure the Trump administration is following that, is you want to transition from the United States as a participant in this Afghan conflict to the United States having a robust ability to support a national unity government, in Afghanistan. And so that presence can be helpful in terms of helping to stabilize Afghanistan should there be an agreement among all the parties. But I also think that for Ambassador Khalilzad, I think his two immediate challenges are, one, to get an understanding with the Taliban, and then two, use that understanding to force a direct conversation between the Afghan government and the Taliban. If he can achieve that's very significant, and then you can find a way to build on that going.
May I say something here?
Sure.
I think that the concept of Taliban and Afghan government sitting across the table is not at this point very realistic. What the solution might be is a broad-based representation of Afghan political leaders, including government, in sitting across the table from the Taliban, because the Taliban want to resolve issues that date back to the 1980s and 90s, and that involves not just Mr. Ghani. It involves
those issues
other issues that have to do with war and conflict and disagreements dating back to the 1990s mainly. And Mr. Ghani was not there, so there are other players in Afghanistan who also have to sit at the table in order to make this a more comprehensive settlement at the end of the day.
So we're not looking at something that's going to happen very quickly. I mean, Afghanistan has elections coming up in September.
Maybe elections.
Maybe. Could they be postponed?
Anything is possible. I mean, elections are slated. Everybody is getting ready for.
Could they be postponed in the hopes that there'll be some kind of
settlement? The mood for elections right now in Afghanistan is very sour. It's not a very strong mood for elections because people realize that the security situation is not amenable, that there's a peace process that is probably more important than elections at this point, and that if there is a chance and opportunity for a durable peace and a just peace to emerge, that would have to postpone elections for the future so that Afghans can sort out other issues and then go to elections altogether. So elections are slated, but it's not guaranteed.
Shuja, let me ask you very quickly, if there is some kind of peace settlement in Afghanistan, does it change the balance of power in the region? Because India right now would like the US to remain in Afghanistan. If the US pulls out, how does that change the balance of power there?
I don't think the US can pull out entirely, so there'll obviously be a phased military withdrawal, but the biggest US lever in the region is economic assistance.
Right.
And that's very critical for whichever government remains in Afghanistan, whatever the shape of that government is, and also for maintaining the Afghan military. Because that's a very sizable amount of investment.
Right.
I was going to say,
Very quickly.
I don't see the United States pulling out. I think the United States transitions to an ability to help nurture and develop the Afghan military over time, including the creation of an Afghan Air Force, which is going to be very important to the ability of the country to protect its sovereignty going forward.
We have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.